Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the Dylan TG Super Lighting tutorial. This is a tutorial where I'll be showing you all the things about lighting, especially if you don't know how to do it. You need to know how to do lighting to make renders. So right away, I created basic pose to just light for the sole purpose of this tutorial. I didn't put a lot of effort into it. Let's go ahead and take a look at what our scene looks like rendered. Obviously, not very good. Not a lot going on. This is the basic default lighting that Blender gives you. So there's a lot we have to do to work on it. Let's get rid of the very powerful light up here. We don't need that. The first thing I do when it comes to lighting anything is I start with an area light. An area light's important because it just allows you to be able to light up with a certain area whatever you need to light. Immediately, I'm going to take a look at well, what color would I want this to be? A lot of lighting setups, I'd like to have a warm light coming from some direction. So I'm going to start by making it a semi-warm color. That feels pretty warm. We also have settings here like diffuse, specular, and volume. Whenever I light a character, I like to turn off volume because in everything I light, I like to use volumetric lighting in some way. Diffuse, it's just basic lighting that affects anything that's kind of a static material. What specular is, it's the reflection of whatever you're lighting up. So that makes it so it only reflects light rather than being diffuse. It affects the specular map on whatever you're lighting. With shape, you control how much the light really spreads out. Like if the light is very small, if it has a very small shape or size, that basically controls how sharp your shadow will be. As you can see, I'm dragging it down and up, and the shadow on her hat is getting more sharp and less sharp the higher I drag it up. It allows light to bend around the character more. Low size, sharper shadow. High size, much smoother shadow. You can also press like S on your keyboard to scale around stuff at ease. Next important thing to talk about is shape. With shape, you control basically how an area light looks. Not just how it looks, but how it affects things. What controlling the shape of whatever your area light will do is with anything reflective or glossy, like this floor that I just turned glossy. It'll change how that thing reflects. So if it's a rectangle, square, it just overall affects how it looks in the reflection, controlling how the light spreads in a certain area. Now we can talk about something called custom distance. In Eevee, lights can have a distance applied to them. It can be either very short and affect things very close to the light, or it can be very far and affect things even further away. This line right here shows how far that distance is. As you scale down, the distance gets smaller and there's less light being spread. So that's a way to basically control the input of that. And now one thing that a lot of beginner Blender users forget or don't know about, which is pretty bad, because you need to know about this, is contact shadows. Put this on every single time you light something, because the difference is palpable. You go from something like this, where it's light bleeding through anything, to this, where there's actually shadows where they're supposed to be. You need to turn on contact shadows by default. So I'm going to use a few area lights here to set up our basic lighting. It's not going to be very complex. There's not going to be a lot to it, but I'm going to try my best to get this to a point where it's something at least visually appealing. I can control the color by obviously changing around the color, and with the power that controls how bright and dark a light is. So just easy settings that you can tweak and mess around with that control the way the lighting looks. Now with this, I'm going for a color scheme since it's a pretty simple pose. I'm dragging around area lights, shading where I want to, shading where I want light to be. That's pretty much my lighting process, is dragging around lights where you want lights to be. For instance, if I take this, I want this to be a light that's so much closer, got a bit smaller shadows, and affects her face a little bit. So I'm going to drag it there, and I'm going to turn down the size until it's just right for what I want it to be. And now we got something somewhat decent looking pretty much right away. All it really is dragging around area lights where you want them to go and setting them up around your skin. You're also going to be doing stuff like rim lighting, where you're lighting stuff from the back, creating a glow rim on the edge of the model. This is very useful, and I use it in most everything, especially things like still renders or scene renders where I need light reflecting from a background and I need to set it up. So this is a rim light. It's a light that affects from behind, that lights the edges, the contours of the shape. It's drawing basically your character's shape, setting up the lighting so that it pops it out from the background. This is very important for stuff like composition, and character lighting, somewhat easy. For the sake of the tutorial, I'm starting off slow and not doing a lot of the things I would normally do, so it doesn't look great yet because I'm still setting stuff up. Now, the next thing I want to talk about right now is spotlights and how you would use those. So spotlights are important because they're a light that allows you to focus light wherever you want to focus it. With an area light, it'll just spread out. There's no really controlling the bounds of how it spreads out, but a spotlight you are able to control. So for a light here, it's just a circle, just a basic circle. You can turn it up, pretty strong circle. That makes sense. But with the blend options here, you can change how much the light blends in from the sides. This is very important for making smooth lighting that can affect certain surfaces different than others. You can also scale along axes to be able to change how it is shaped. So if I press S and X, it's able to scale along the X axis and change the way the light affects from that angle. If I scale here, that's just basically doing nothing but changing where the guiding lines are for the spotlight. And if you press S and Z, you scale along the Z axis, which changes basically how large of an area that you want to affect. So by dragging those in and out and messing around with those, you're able to see pretty much the outlines of exactly where the light is going to hit. One of the things I like to use it for, other than just like focusing light on a certain area, like if I want light to hit specifically this dark area, I don't know why I would, I could scale it, mess around with the scale, and it would only affect there. Something I would use that for, that's, I guess, if it were in that shadow, I guess I'd do it a very dim lighting, and it would affect that area. One thing I like to do a lot in my renders is have a light up towards the face, scale it in, to basically set kind of a highlight for where you want to look in your render. Turn on contact shadows, obviously. And with that, you can kind of smooth out some of those darker areas on your face or whatever you're lighting. And it looks much better than if it were like, this is with it off, and this is applying some power. You have a much smoother face and, you know, smoother lighting on that face. And it's also more of a highlight for the user to look at. There's also spotlights, which take light and light them around an individual point. These spotlights have the same thing as the others, with size as a radius, which basically changes how wide of an area is affected. You can see if the radius is clipping through everything, the direct outline of the radius. So what you want to do when messing around with that is make sure it's not clipping through anything. You want to set it to a size that gets pretty much wherever you want to be lit. Spotlights I like to use around areas that would be glowing. Like for here, I don't have the effects set up because I'm lazy, but I would want like somewhat of a glowy radius coming out of this area. So I'd set it to something of a blue, and that would affect anything in that radius that you would want it to. And of course, custom distance, you can control how much is affected by dragging it down. You don't really have a line to play off of here with the custom distance, so you just want to scale it to whatever you think works best. I don't know that this works too well, and it's off to the side, so it's not really something that the user will be able to see. I think it looks better without it. But yeah, that's spotlights. They have pretty simple uses, and there's a lot of stuff you can use them for that I'm going to show off later in this video. I'm going to finish off some lighting here, get some spots I want cleaned up, want the lighting on the hat brighter. Other things like wanting the lighting on the hand, I go to the hand, make sure to put an area light that's kind of dim, but at least makes it so the dark spots are cleared out a little bit. Now I'm going to get on to world lighting. World lighting is very important for controlling the environment around the character. So if I go to Object and World lighting. We have a background and we have a world output. Adjusting the strength changes how bright the background is and how bright the world lighting shadows are. There's also a way to make it so we can increase the brightness of the world and the brightness of the shadows individually by duplicating the background with Shift D, adding a mix shader, and plugging the two into it just like this, and also adding a light path node, plugging is camera ray into the factor. We can now control the strengths of both the background and the shadows individually. So the top one will control how bright the shadows are. The bottom one will control how bright the world itself is. This is very important for scene renders and anything we want to do with like a sky. But what if we want good reflections coming off of something like this? Like our plane here should be reflecting something, but it's not. Well, that's where environment textures and HDRI textures come into play. Now, HDRI textures are easy to get. It's not hard to find them. You can find them in any of the links I have in the description. For instance, a website like HDRI Haven is very good for finding decent sky domes and HDRIs to light your scenes. I'm going to use a simple HDRI of just the Fortnite Chapter 5 skybox. Now, it's bright. It's way too bright. And that typically is how it works with strengths over 3. So I'm going to set it to about a 1. And I also want the background to be affected by this HDRI. So you can see we have the skybox. If I hit Control T, as long as I have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, go into add-ons and type Node Wrangler to see if you have it. Tick it on if it's not already. It should be. Blender should make it so it's on by default, but Control T adds mapping and texture coordinate nodes immediately. And you can rotate around the Z-axis to rotate where along that the HDRI sits. Now, this could be useful for doing skies or backgrounds. Typically, I don't use HDRIs for backgrounds. I make my own, but we'll get to that later. And one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you want the shadows in certain areas to be of a color that's not quite represented. If you're really looking for a shadow in a particular spot to be a particular color, you can take a color amp and put it between the background and the color, and you can basically just shift it to whatever you want the shadow color to be. Keep in mind this affects reflections, so you have to be careful with what you're working with. That being said, let me get rid of that, get rid of that. I'm going to do something completely different for the background. If we want the background to be just a basic sky or something, we could take a gradient texture, Control T to get the mapping and texture coordinate, and plug it into the background. Now we have a simple gradient for our world. By taking this and rotating it 90 degrees on the y-axis, we control basically a gradient of what the sky would be. This is great for creating custom skies, like I like to do in a lot of my renders with a color ramp. So what you can do is you can take your lighting, whatever you want it to be. Usually it would start brighter at the bottom and get darker going up. So what I do is scale it to whatever you want it to be, wherever you want it to start, and maybe have it be something like a yellowy color, and then transition to something like a blue, and get darker as it goes up in the sky. You can do stuff like that for simple world lighting. Of course, this is fairly rushed. It's not like I'm attempting to get very much done here, but like that's a simple idea of how you could get a sky going, and you can increase the strength to make it brighter, darker, etc. What I'm going to do for the sake of this render is I'm going to make it simple, and I'm just going to keep it, say a color, like a purple, like a purpley color. I'm actually not even going to use the background. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, edit mode, and along this axis, scale it up, extrude, bevel it with Control B, and scroll wheel to increase the amount of cuts. And I'm going to shade smooth. For the complete purpose of the tutorial, decided to make it metallic and glossy, but I'm not going to be doing that here. I'm actually trying to get rid of all the specular, make it not glow at all, basically be completely rough. And I'm going to go for a darker color, like a purple. So now we have something like this. The number one thing you need to know about lighting is that it's all about messing around. And you're never going to get everything right the first time around. So one use here of spotlights, it's affecting the ground with this area lamp. I'm going to turn this one off for now. for the demonstration of it, but the light here is affecting the ground. We don't want that. We want it to be just affecting her. So what you can do is you can take it, turn it into a spotlight, scale it down on the y-axis. See, it's still affecting the ground, but if we hit the right angle and turn up the blend a little bit, while also increasing the power, we can control where the light hits and make it so it only affects her rather than the ground as well. I think it's this light that's affecting the ground. We only really want it to affect this area. So that's an example of using custom distance. We can go and decrease it. Now this area of light on the ground is no longer there. Now we have one more light affecting the ground, and that's okay, because I want to have a light from this area go and affect it from above. I'm going to take off custom distance. Generally goes something like that. And I'm going to focus the lighting here since this spot is a bit brighter than I would like it to be. By moving this upwards just a little, we can actually get rid of that spot on the ground. One thing I like to do that I don't know many others who actually do it is use a special Blender version called Eevee with Screen Space Global Illumination, which allows you to simulate sort of a ray tracing effect. I've been using it this whole time to make the render look better. This is it without, this is with. So it does cause a significant change to how lighting looks in Eevee. What it allows for is simulated bounces of lighting. Lighting bouncing off of certain places and hitting others. Like, for instance, light bouncing off the hat and making a kind of pink purpley area underneath here. Light bouncing off the skin on the leg and making the shoe go from a grayish tone to a warmer skin tone from light bouncing off. It's like what makes walking through a forest in the summer look like it has green shadows all over the place. It's simulating stuff like that, but in Eevee, which is, you know, something they're working on implementing into base Eevee, but with this custom Blender version, which I have linked in the description, you're able to control stuff like that by controlling the injected probe GI intensity. With nothing, there's no bouncing, no light bouncing, and with some, the light starts to bounce until it's at, you know, max value. One thing you can do that not a lot of people know about is by increasing values of most things to 2, 3, 4, 5. You can go well over the amount that you think you should be restricted to. This is useful for stuff like lighting as well, because you can take these and think, okay, well, I want it to affect diffuse way more than I want it to affect specular. And of course, you could achieve this by turning this down and keeping this up and increasing the power, but you also could just take diffuse and press 5 and go way above 1, and now you're increasing it to a ridiculous amount. I tend to do this a lot with volume, which is something I haven't gotten to yet, but I'm about to. Ambient occlusion will make it so there's a simulated shadow of something underneath if it gets close. So you want to take that on. Bloom, it depends how much you want. Your threshold controls how much bloom is in your scene. So if you want a ton of bloom, you can keep it very low, though don't, because don't. But it starts off as 0.8. For larger renders, I tend to make it 1 or 2 to control how much bloom is really there. For here, I'm going to keep it 1, just because it looks kind of nice to have that light bouncing. So now, I'm going to start with volumetric lighting. And to do so, I'm going to add a cube to the scene. I'm going to go into its viewport display and the properties down here. I'm going to display it as wire bounds. What that does is makes it so it's not solid, taking up a ton of room on your screen, and allows you to see a lot more of your scene, especially in object view and other stuff. You just have to remember that it's now set to bounds of a general area. So with that in mind, go into shading, click new. For your principled BDSF, you want to set it to a principled volume. So now, plugging volume to volume, not surface. Do not set it to surface. If you do, it's just not going to be anything at all. And it's just not going to work, especially if you have it in solid view and viewport. Now you have a cube of volume, which what this means is any light that affects volume, such as this one here that I've just imported, it'll basically make light that travels through particles in the air, or of course, in this case, just volume. So you can change the color. It'll change how it affects the volume. You want to use volume in almost every single render you ever do. It'll always be used in some way, shape, or form. And this is where a lot of 3D artists struggle a little bit, is they don't use volume. Even in a small scene like this, because it makes a huge difference on how your scene looks overall. I'm going to start by dragging this cube in here and scaling it up a bit, making sure it's taking up the radius that I want it to. I can drag it into these lights and have it not affect it, because earlier in the video, I took volume and turned it off for everything here. So I can have volume be affected by other personalized lighting that I want it to be. It's dark because the volume particulates are basically taking up all that room and making it dark. So what you can do to control that is take the density and go something like 0.1 is still strong, but for the purpose of this video, it works with what we want to do. So let's say 0.1. We have volume there. You can't see it because we're not affecting it with anything. So let's take an area light and drag it into our volume. Make it affect nothing else. Now we have a little bit of a volume background here. Say we want lighting to be coming from this angle, the color of how it's lighting her face. Volumes can be used for a variety of reasons, and it should not just stop at simple lighting like this, but this is one of the uses you can make of it. You could also, like, say, put it on the other end and do like a purple, so it like blends nicely. That's one of the uses you could have for volumes, creating nice little lighting backgrounds and smoothing out your backgrounds. But what else can you do with volumes? Well, there's a lot of things you can do with them. For instance, if you want to take a volume and make it really dense, that'll change how little light spreads or how much light spreads through that volume. You can change the color. It'll adjust how the light interacts with it, how the light affects the overall scene. If you keep it white or a gray, that'll have it work more with whatever you're trying to do. Because if you change the color, the light isn't going to stay the color that you have it originally. Density is where the fun starts, because you can do a lot with density. For instance, you can go and add a noise texture. Control T to get a mapping and texture coordinate, and plug that straight into the density. Now, that doesn't do much yet, but with a color ramp or similar node, by dragging the black closer to the white, you start to see, okay, we've got a bit going on with like some smoke, some smoky type thing going on in the background. And to see this more clearly, go into Volumetrics tab in Properties and set tile size to 2 pixels for more color depth. Another thing with volume for wide scenes, I don't know how many people will do this, but I happen for a lot of my larger scenes using volume for entire atmospheres for the scene. So I'll want to set the end distance to something super high. But keep in mind, the higher your end distance goes, the less in-depth your closer volume becomes. This is with a volume distance of 1,000, and your closer in-depth volume is suddenly a lot weaker. And even if it goes super high, you can get to the point where your closer volume becomes practically invisible. You have to balance this. You have to make sure that if you go 100, you're doing scenes that are very close. If you're going 1,000, you might want to render on separate layers if you want to have some closer volumes or further volumes. One thing to think about is how you want it to look, how you want to scale it, how you want the detail to be, what you want the roughness to look like. One thing you can do to preview that without taking up a ton of resources, if we go to Viewport Display and display as solid again, we can see how the pattern is going to show up. We can increase detail, it'll become more realistic smoke, scale it down and up, and stuff like roughness will like make it grainy, or of course not grainy, less rough. So if I go increase the details on this and I increase the scale, it'll show up as a much smokier volume. Your white is your density on a scale up to 1. Imagining your color ramp is a scale from 0 to 1, black being 0, this being 1. You're able to change how bright it is, how much density it is, based off of that scale. If you want it to be more like the original, this is completely at 0.1. This is mixing between the two. This is bringing it up, and mixing between something like that, like nothing, and 0.1. The possibilities are quite literally endless for how you can control a smoky looking background like this. And you can find dozens of uses, like fog, where it's like sweeping across the ground, or even clouds, which I'm going to get to soon. Another thing you can do is by adding a math node, setting it to multiply, and setting it to 1. This makes it the exact same. But what you can actually do is with the density that you provided in the noise texture, you can plug it into your emission strength, and suddenly you have an emission of whatever color you want. So you can set it to a color like this, or this, and scale it down. And now your insides of your shadow, it can be whatever color you want. So you don't necessarily need light to affect it to be visible. And this can be very useful for stuff like environments as well, and especially cloud. I'm not going to play around with emission color too much. I want a background that's fairly simple, so I'm going to set the value to 0.1 again and run with that. One thing that can be done that's very useful with volume, hitting a point light, putting it in your scene somewhere, and of course I'm going to enable contact shadows, and I'm going to make it not affect diffuse and specular. I'm going to move this into the scene a bit, and I'm going to center it behind her. This is an example of something that I like to do where I can emit light rays around a central point. So what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to set it to a color like this, and I'm going to create a UV sphere. Now I'm going to position that UV sphere directly in the middle of that light, and I'm going to cover it up. I'm going to snuff out all the light, make sure it can't get out, and there we have it. It is completely covered by this sphere. And there's a way to take this and make light rays escape around a central point by using a diffuse, a mix shader, and a transparency. By plugging this and this together and moving it to here, we have a semi-transparent texture. But we can control how and where it's transparent with a noise texture. Control T again, a gradient, color ramp to control where. Now I'm going to go shade smooth, and in my material tab, I'm going to make sure the blend mode is alpha blend, and shadow mode, especially alpha hashed. So now we've got something. We have a lot of light coming out from this spot, and that's because the way we have it is on a gradient. But what we can do, we can control that. We can bring the lights closer to the darks, and we can control how much light gets out where. And with this method, we can make kind of a God rays glow coming from wherever you want. And keep in mind, with Eevee volumetrics, the light can bleed if you're not careful. Like, it's bleeding through her here. Sometimes what you gotta do to fix that is just like move the light back further, like I just did there, and that fixed it. And now we have a big bright glow coming from behind her. One thing I learned you can do is add a spotlight, make it super thin. So I'm gonna scale it down like this, like something like this. And that's one instance where you can use like volume, say you want it to affect volume more. You can just like put in a quick number and it multiplies whatever you have by whatever that number is. And by controlling the blend size, you can make kind of an artificial, if you control D, you can make an artificial, control D, press R, rotate, control D, press R, rotate, light ray system. You can just kind of have light burst through your scene. Now, this is pretty weak and it takes a lot of tinkering around with, but this can be very versatile and have God rays come out wherever you want. Now, for something that's really tough, clouds. Now, this is not a scene where I'd want to do clouds by any means, but let me move over to a scene where I would want to do clouds. Now, I have a couple shortcuts that I've made for myself with clouds that make it much easier, and, you know, that comes down to what you're willing to do, what time you're willing to put in. I made a mini asset pack for myself using VDB files. I'll link a few VDB file downloads in the description below. We're going for like a cloud like these, like in the HDRI. What I do for my clouds is I have a density of some sort, a color that's kind of warm, kind of day, an emission color that's blue. And I use the volume info from the VDB file, plugged density into a multiply to control how bright the emission is. Like, if I have no emission, it's going to be pitch black shadows, and you don't want that. That's our basic cloud. But why is it not doing anything? What we need to make sure is that we have our tile size set to something decent, like 4 or 2. You want to make sure volumetric shadows is toggled on. If you keep in mind, with clouds, you're going to have relatively large scenes, and there's a cutoff to where it's no longer going to render in your view anymore. And how you can fix that is increasing your volumetric endpoint, like I talked about earlier. And keep in mind, once again, this will change whether close volumetrics work or will not work as much. And our sun, let's just move it here. It's doing something, clearly, not well, but it's doing something. With volume, I like to take diffuse and specular off again, so my sun can affect the clouds differently. And I go with a pretty high strength for clouds, like 25. And you have, immediately, a nice little cloud lighting. But from far away, or close up, the cloud lacks depth. You'll be able to especially see that with larger scenes. So what I'll do to get around that, and a lot of people don't know about, I don't think, is increasing the angle to something like 65 or 75. And that'll allow the light to bleed more through the cloud, making it softer. So that's how you do stuff like a cloud, like a simple cloud. And it looks good from like most every angle. You know, there's a lot you can do. And of course you can customize this to your liking, however you like. Now, of course, you don't need to use a VDB file. You can customize and create your own cloud. But, you know, with Eevee and Blender nodes, that can be pretty difficult. Another thing I have here is a customizable smoke that I've made for myself. That's not very complicated. I like to use these in a lot of scenes. They don't just have to be for clouds. They can be for smoke going across the ground, etc. I highly recommend everyone look up creating asset libraries. They are very useful. It's very worth doing. It's not something I can just kind of link, unfortunately, but it's something I really like to do, and I recommend everyone give a try, at least, to do. Say I want something like a smoky purple, like going across the ground. I can go in my shader editor. I'm going to turn down the emission quite a bit. Honestly, I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to set my color back to a gray. And I'm going to turn down my density quite a bit, because I want it to be there and present, but not too overbearing. It's going to be hard to get volume in here without affecting other places. So I'm just going to go and make it kind of a purple tinge. I'm going to increase the density a little bit so we can tell it's there. There's more and more you can do. I've done it several times before. I'll show some pictures of how I've used these effects before on the screen throughout the video. I have done a few of those, but I'll show a few more ways that you can like customize, etc. That is pretty much, in terms of lighting, everything I really care or want or could think of to show off the top of my head. Stuff like this, it's you know, honestly, the more you do it, the better you get with it. So yeah, with that being said, light your scenes, have fun. There's a lot to do. At the end of the day, you light how you want to light, you do what you want to do, and just have fun with it. I'll see you all in the next one, and yeah, see you later.